Hey folks, welcome back to the Cloud Native Now podcast. We've taken a little bit of a hiatus while we get some new players involved, and my new partner is Paul Nashawaty from the Futurum Group. And if you've been under a rock, the Futurum Group acquired TechStrong Group, which is the parent company for Cloud Native Now. So we're going to be working this podcast together from here on out. Paul, welcome.
Thank you, Mike. I'm glad to be here. It's exciting times. I'm really excited about the acquisition, about what we're doing, and mainly just really excited about the space. It's really growing and what's happening in the space.
Totally. So let's just jump in. This week, we kind of saw the release of Kubernetes 1.30, and there's a lot of new capabilities in there. The ones that kind of leaped out at me were in the alpha side of it, where they were talking about the ability to have read-only data, and they also had an ability to have more control over how you route traffic from and to an endpoint from the Kubernetes cluster. And I scratched my head a little bit, and I applaud them for these capabilities. But I wonder from a seasoned IT perspective, if you're kind of like looking at that going, I kind of thought we would have had these capabilities by now. And there's one of these kind of, moments where the senior IT people are probably going, well, bless their little hearts, they figured that out.
Yeah, Mike, it's really interesting. You would think that some of the maturity for Kubernetes is really kind of already adopting some of the fundamentals that you would think that were part of the platform and what's happening with cloud native and cloud native adoption for those applications really, really kind of need some of those new features. But what I do like about this release is there's, parameters that allow for dynamic resource allocation. There's node memory swapping that really has that support, and also user namespaces and pods, right? That's a big factor when it comes to management, especially across distributed cloud environments, right? When you look at distributed cloud environments and having to do the efficiencies and security across the cluster, is important to have that as well.
What is your sense of where are enterprises on this journey with, I've talked to some folks and they're still running clusters as far back as Kubernetes 1.12, and some folks are calling for more of a long-term release edition of Kubernetes that they can maybe stabilize on because they're not fully bought into the whole DevOps motion where they're only going to be 3 releases behind. And I think a lot of folks are hesitant to touch a cluster because they don't know what APIs are deprecated from one to the other, and they don't know what will break.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think the thing that we have to take into consideration here is what we see in organizations in our research. We see that skill gap is a major challenge, right? And developing these new applications is probably top of mind not probably, but according to our research, we see it is top of mind to CIOs. They need to modernize, right? They're focused on modernization. And there's such a backlog of heritage applications that either need to be refactored or, frankly, just maybe even just encapsulated into a VM to move to the cloud, right? So there's a lot of kind of areas. But to your point of deprecated features and API calls that may or may not be there and such, then the challenge with that not being current is because this is such an rapidly emerging environment. Adding things like, resource-based pools for auto-scaling and common expression languages, those are nice features, right? Great features for those applications that need it. But really what's more important is when it comes to efficiencies and security. Security is key, right? If you're not updated to the latest version and you may have introduced a security hole that you may not even know. And that's a problem with those bots and customers. So it's important to stay up to date.
There's a lot of debate about when to use Kubernetes these days, and it was a subject of discussion over at the recent Google Cloud Next conference. And part of the issue was there are 2 ways of going after this. There are basic container services that I can use to deploy my application that are more accessible to your average developer, and there is no Kubernetes, and Google has one, and I'm pretty sure, I think Amazon has one as well. Or I can use Kubernetes, which is a little more complex and seems to require the developer to know more about what the underlying infrastructure is about. Are we getting better at sorting out which platform to use when for what?
It's a great question. I had the same discussion with Bobby Allen, right? He's responsible for the product manager at Google Cloud. And, one of the main focus points, he and Richard were all talking about the fact that there needs to be a simplification process to building these applications, right? To really accelerate development teams to move forward and providing a platform. Being out at that event, it was huge, right? There was 30,000 plus people there. There was a lot of interest. So that just shows me that there's a lot of interest in learning, interest in understanding how to take their existing organizations to the next level, where they're going and how they're modernizing. But I will say that, according to our research, what we find is in our latest, just out this week, so this is new data to share this week, in our latest observability study, we see that 93% of organizations are running on 2 or more clouds, right? And 93% sounds like a lot, but this is production applications running on 2 or more clouds. So if they're doing this, what I was talking to Bobby about and Richard about was the fact that, does Google provide a reason to go with native functionality exclusively? Or is it really more looking at across these distributed cloud environments and harmonizing the deployment across these environments to make it more ease of use across these multiple ecosystems, right? So in that same study, we were finding that 20% of respondents indicated that application portability was critical to their environment. 67% said it was very important. So that, in my mind, is saying if you're delivering on Google, and if Google has made it easier to deploy, and you can get an enhancement of native functionality, then by all means go for it, right, and do it. But if you're looking at an ecosystem where you have multiple clouds, our last year's data, we saw that 65% of organizations are running on 4 or more clouds. So they're running on 4 or more clouds, and you have to develop in each one of those different hyperscalers. That means you have to have developer skill set to do that. And if you have that developer skill set in-house to do that, that's a unicorn. You pay them whatever they need, because you'll never find them again. Mm-hmm. But then there's other approaches. So do you go with an OpenShift, or do you go to a Tanzu? Do you go to one of these types of platforms to harmonize? Those are options, and you just have to look at the best path for your business.
All right, well, we'll come back to Tanzu in a minute, but I want to ask you a little bit more about this observability study, because we've talked about that topic on this show in the past, and it seems like it's a slow roll. A lot of folks are still relying on monitoring tools that, just basically let them track a set of predefined metrics. And when I talk to folks about observability, they kind of get the fact that the environments are becoming more complex and they need something more, but they also look at me and go, this stuff is great, but I'll be honest, I have no idea what questions to ask this thing.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I mean, when I look at the bell curve of observability practices within organizations, over the last 3 years, I've been doing trending data across the observability market and the challenges the space has had. And in our global study this year, we have 848 respondents globally. It's a great study. It has a lot of data asking specifics about maturity, right? Asking specifics about what tools people are using and why they're using those tools. But to answer your question, I think that there's every step of the stage. Like if you look at the curve, right? There's the outliers on the right. Probably a small percentage are fully mature, right, and fully get what an observability practice means to their organization. And then there's a large percentage on the left, and I wouldn't even call them outliers, but there's a large percent on the left that are kind of on that emerging education, monitoring, alerting, understanding what's going on in the environment. But then you get that bell in the middle that get bridge into the tracing and understanding the logs, and then taking actionable insights. But then, that's the piece that many organizations are looking to get to in that maturity curve. And according to our research, we're seeing that that's where the trending is going. So over the last 3 years, we've seen that trending moving upwards towards that bell in the middle, where people are using that full stack observability solutions in a platform approach versus individual tools, because the individual tools not only increases your TCO, but it also increases your complexity. And previously, what I just said, skill gap is a major issue.
Well, speaking of that skills gap, and we were going to talk about Tanzu and Broadcom and the VMware saga that goes on there, but if you look at Tanzu, what they seem to be saying is they want to unify what we're kind of calling platform engineering, and also provide a platform that makes it easier for developers to build and deploy these cloud native applications. And when I talk to the developer community, it kind of goes like this. There's a small handful of full stack developers who can really manage to work with Kubernetes. And then they seem to have spent the last few years convincing IT operations teams to deploy it, who seem to like it now because it gives them a centralized platform and a common set of APIs. But then it turns out the rest of the developer community seems to be dragging their heels on this because it's just too hard for them to work with. And I hear VMware and Red Hat and all these other folks promising that they have a better app dev environment, but I'm not seeing like everybody rush into it.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think part of the challenge is there's like any solution. Tanzu fell into this scenario. They had to be. There was two things that happened. One, as they were growing the platform, they were very broad in their kind of approach. But then they were also at the same time very methodical about, hey, we want to focus on Spring. We want to focus on Spring apps, right? And make sure that that's the focus area. So, but where the developers were not adopting, the platforms, this is where, I think that if there was a broader approach to other application platforms or, just different development languages, there may have been more adoption of Tanzu. I do think that Broadcom acquisition and VMware and Tanzu, and specifically, I'm not going to go into all those other details, but specifically on Tanzu, one of the things that developers do like is flexibility and choice. When we look at what recently occurred with Broadcom, the deprecation of 54 different products within the Tanzu platform, they took away, or I should say the VMware platform, they took away a lot of that flexibility, right? But they said but in order to get it, you have to buy, the platform, right? And I can appreciate that, but sometimes that breaks the model of what a developer's looking to do. I had the pleasure of speaking with Raghu before he moved on. And, one of the things that we talked about was the context of providing developers with a bag of bits, right? You don't want to provide bag of bits to developers because they just don't know what to do with it. When frankly, it's just not useful. But also providing them a full-blown platform doesn't exactly give the flexibility that they may need. So I understand it from the Broadcom perspective. I do. I think that it makes a lot of sense to simplify the sales motion, simplify the user experience, and make it easier for the customers to absorb the products. But you can't take away that functionality that they once had in the platform, only to make it simpler to deploy.
And I think there's a lot of work to be done there, because otherwise it's the platform engineering team shows up and says, this is our platform and thou shalt write to this thing. And the developers look at them and just shake their head and go, I think I got something else I need to do. So we'll see what happens, but
we will. Yeah, for sure.
Work will be done there. I'd also like to jump into security. And this week we saw a couple of things where Tetrate is making it easier to do authentication in Kubernetes. And I don't know if you saw, Red Hat has a bunch of new tools this week aimed at developers to make it easier for them to build more secure applications. Do you think security was an afterthought in Kubernetes, and is that situation getting better?
Yeah, I mean, security is obviously, a way that you have to go slower to go faster, right? If you don't have a secure solution, you just compromise your entire organization. So with regards to, the Tetrate kind of announcement and utilizing Istio service mesh for ways to deploy and manage, I think that the Istio kind of deployment in Kubernetes secrets, deployment really helps with providing a more secure way to dynamically manage the application authentication, really without having to write too much more code, right? So that's a plus. The question is do you want to add sidecars to your environment? So do you want to have this kind of way or approach? I do like Istio's ambient approach to doing this kind of more kind of collection of responses, so you can have that cross east-west traffic that way. and have it secured with the ambient approach. But I think that, obviously having the security elements within your application is critical to the business success. You can't launch a new application and go, okay, it's full of security holes and it shuts down your business. That's just not acceptable.
I think if and when Istio finally gains traction, I think 90% of those folks are going to be running the ambient version when all is said and done, because it seems like it's a lot lighter and a lot easier for developers to wrap their heads around.
I agree. I mean, I think it's and I think I would say that Istio and all the vendors that support Istio, that put solutions to market, are definitely looking at that approach.
All right. Last topic that I want to get to is Wasm, WebAssembly. We saw Cosmonic again was talking about how they're going to enable Wasm on Kubernetes. And I get some folks out there who, are saying Wasm will replace containers. This will be the thing that will make it more portable, shall we say, because everything will run naturally on either Windows or Linux or wherever else you may care to run the thing. And that seemed like a lot of promise. I seem to remember hearing this for the first time 30 years ago when some Java guys were hanging around talking about write once, deploy anywhere, right?
Yeah.
Is Wasm for real in your mind, or is it still in the realm of interesting computer science?
Oh, for sure. Well, I'm glad you saved the best topic for last, in my opinion, because I love Wasm. I could talk all day on this. But, Cosmonic is definitely one of the companies out there that is kind of leading the charge around this, right? Whether it's Taylor Thomas or Liam Randall, that are kind of like, I've had many conversations with Liam about, the vision of where they're going, what they're doing, and the adoption curve. I will tell you that, like, from a Wasm perspective, I've been writing on Wasm for a number of years, probably about 3-4 years now. I've been writing on Wasm, right? And when in 2022, it was like, okay, this is kind of cute. It does its thing. It's great for like Python and Go applications. Good, right? But in 2023 was a breakthrough year for Wasm, right? But it added support for like .NET applications. It added multi-threading. So now you're getting into like real applications, not that Go and Python weren't real applications, but it's the use cases are now much broader. And, to answer your question, Mike, when we look at, I was at KubeCon in Paris a couple of weeks back. And, when I think about the keynote, right, and companies like Fermion were up there, right, talking about Wasm or what's going on. But that's all well and good when vendors are talking about, what they're doing, right? But then you get end users at the keynote at KubeCon talking about the advantages. So, Zeiss, a manufacturing organization, it talked about 50% performance gains by using Wasm. It was impressive. That's a real use case. Like, now you take what I would say maybe an academic exercise to a reality of a use case that is monetized, right? That now you can take that and say, okay, this is really more than just something that's running as an incubator project in the CNCF or as a sandbox project. It's actually a real project in production in these organizations. And when we think of Wasm, I like to talk about as practice lead for app dev. I talk about the story of past, present, and future when we talk about applications, right? So you have heritage applications, you have containerized and microservices applications, and then future, I think about Wasm and I think of serverless and where that's going. And you made a comment, Mike, about does Wasm take the place of containers? Does Wasm take the place of microservices and Kubernetes? And I would say it like this. I'm going to mention skill gap, right? There's a skill gap for organizations to refactor from the heritage applications to today's state of containerization. That skill gap of either learning container and microservices architectures or learning Wasm in order to, or WebAssembly in order to get to where they need to go is a question. Like, do you invest in learning WebAssembly? Because here's why there's an advantage of using WebAssembly. If you're building applications, and as a developer, we know that there's 2 to 3 times more applications being created today than just a few years ago with a fraction of the resources. You just can't throw any more hands at the problem. So using WebAssembly all you need to focus on for the application development is the 10% of business logic. The 90% of the application, you don't need to worry, right? The other big factor is you don't need to recompile Wasm applications based on the underlying technology. So if you think about Wasm on the factory floors or Wasm in the edge or edge locations, if you have edge locations that are IoT devices or ARM processors or Intel or AMD, you don't have to recompile those applications to work at those locations. You can just use Wasm and it allows you to have modernized applications. Now, I will add one piece to it. Kubernetes plays a factor here. You still will need some way of orchestrating those cloud-native applications across your ecosystem. That's when your Kubernetes comes into play. So Kubernetes and Wasm kind of go together. Containerization, microservices is the present state. That's where organizations are looking at. But definitely it's a contender for future technology stacks.
We shall see. When I look in at some of those Wasm projects that are still in early stages, some of them smell like orchestration engines for Wasm. So we'll see what's going to happen here long term. Because, I mean, honestly, if you were going to build an orchestration engine for Wasm as a brand new thing, would you use Kubernetes as the model for it? Or would you say, yeah, maybe that was a cannon trying to kill a fly?
It's a good point. It's a really good point. I mean, what we're seeing in our research today, 39% of organizations are looking and using Wasm with production applications. So that's a pretty good statement. And we will see, because I mean, I think you're right. If they're blending today with what they already have in their ecosystem, so if they already have Kubernetes, that makes sense. If they don't have Kubernetes, why put Kubernetes in if you don't need it? So it's a good point.
We will wait to see how it all comes together. Hey, Paul, I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. It's great to have you on the team, and I'm looking forward to doing this every week.
Likewise. Thank you very much.
All right. And thank you all for listening or watching, depending on your mode of content medium of the day, whichever one you're favoring of the moment. But once again, if you have something on your mind that you'd like to see us discuss, by all means, send an email to mike@techstronggroup.com and we'll get on the case. Until then, we'll talk to you next time.